This is lecture 125A, Hitler Attacks. We'll begin with the Western Front Revisited. The German attack on the USSR stalled. On 1st of September 1939, the Nazi-led German capitalists struck Poland as their first step in settling accounts with the British and French caps from 1918. However, the cap rulers of England and France did not want to go to war with Germany and staged a phony war, hoping not to provoke the Fuhrer, and that they could still send him to the east. Now Stalin, for his part, had made every possible effort to forge an alliance with Britain and France to contain Hitler, but every effort was rebuffed, including the one at the last minute in July and August of 1939, when he made tremendous overtures to both the French and British regimes for a collective security agreement against Nazi Germany. The result had been the London government sending a low-ranking delegation by slow boat to Murmansk, and France from no response at all. Now Stalin then directed Molotov to seek a non-aggression treaty with Germany. It succeeded, and the USSR avoided war. The greed and fanaticism of the British and French ruling classes had blinded them to the possibility, nay certainty, that Hitler would strike against them first and finish the unfinished business of the First World War, simultaneously bringing both France and England into the Nazi orbit. Hitler almost succeeded. Stalin had turned the tables on the British and French capitalists with the Soviet-German non-aggression treaty. In September 1939, Red Army forces moved into Poland and Eastern Europe, and Soviet attack units moved closer to the new Soviet-German frontier. Along their way, there were other fascists to be dealt with. Some of the worst were in Poland, in the officer class of the feudal army. This class of parasitical bloodsuckers had reduced Polish workers to virtual slaves and committed every imaginable crime against the working people of Poland. They were our most lethal enemies in that part of the world, and we would have to fight them again eventually. They ended up in our hands as the Red Army moved into Poland, and that was the end of them. On the 16th of September 1939, in the meantime, in the Far East, the Japanese capitalists had sued for peace with the Soviet Union. Now we come to a section I like to call tying off loose ends at Katyn. In mid-September 1939, the boss was meeting with Cheka Chief Lavrenti Beria. Lavrenti, our troops have occupied the agreed-upon territory along the old Curzon line, as you know. What you may only be learning about is the arrival of many thousands of fascist Polish officers on our territory, running from the Krauts. These are our most deadly enemies in Poland, and I want them dealt with as we did with similar elements in Latvia, Estonia, and Lithuania, and most recently in Finland. Deportation? No, that's what I mean. Similar elements, fascist infectious parasites. Deportation and the chance to start over the right way are fine for the normal bourgeois elements, especially the recalcitrant petty bourgeois farmers. However, these fascist Polish army officers are deadly infectious germs. They are sworn to our destruction. There is no rehabilitation possible here. They are the leftovers of our defeat at Warsaw in 1920. We owe them death as a special category of enemy equivalent to the Black Death. I do not intend to give them any more of a break than they gave the millions of our fellow workers and farmers in Poland they have treated like farm animals, except without as much kindness. And these are the same types that killed my wife. Now, besides, as soon as the war with Germany starts, they will be back on the side of reaction, helping the Nazis, if we leave them alive now. We will just have to kill them later if we don't do it now, and they will take a lot of our men with them, since they will have guns and be part of the fascist assault. Anyway, on the main point, revenge is often a dish best served cold. You know what to do. Yes, I have already sent 4 divisions of NKVD troops to Katyn to take the situation in hand. These divisions are made up of hardcore communists, mostly of Jewish extraction. There are some 20,000 of those fascist motherfucking Poles there so far, Koba. Good thinking. Felix used to do the same thing in the Ukraine. We will not have to worry about those men and women getting soft on the Black Hundred kind of scum. Just be sure their poor kids are sent directly to our orphanages. If they aren't orphans yet, they will be in a few days. Anyway, can you handle it? Yes, it'll take a couple of days. We'll get to it and step it up. My weather forecasters tell me permafrost is at most 48 hours away at Katyn. They should be shot and buried before the ground freezes. I have meetings until midnight. Then join us in the Kremlin if you like. I've got a new Chaplin movie. Thank you, Koba. I'll see you then. Now, switching back to 1940, in a lightning strike, Hitler moved against Scandinavia, Benelux, and into France, using the plans provided to him by England's one-time king, the Duke of Windsor, a longtime Nazi. The Nazi spearhead circumvented the Maginot Line. The Krauts found French commanders, hopefully withdrawing, inviting the Nazis to take their country. It was the typical fifth column betrayal the world had gotten used to seeing by the big capitalists and their bourgeois allies against their respective nations, their hope being that the fascists would be good enough to liquidate their organized labor movement when they took over, which of course they did. For more on this, see the endnote number 35, The Nazi Duke, in my book, The Buccaneer, and the 23 edition, second edition is ebook form at Kindle Books. Now, British troops could have been rolled up by the Nazis while they lay trapped in France at Dunkirk, but Hitler was absolutely certain that this last of the parliamentary regimes of capitalist Europe would see reason and surrender to his forces, and he stopped. Then he got the big surprise. Britain's new Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, with his perfect command of European history, and his worldliness that came from having been all over Africa and Asia in his youth as part of one military campaign or another, and a brief stint as prisoner of war in an Afrikaner camp from which he escaped, was not afraid of labor so much as he was of Hitler. A good anti-communist himself, he saw the Soviet Union as far less of a threat to Great Britain than the Nazis. He did not intend to make a deal with the gutter-snipe Hitler. Churchill, being the son of a lord, was quite class-conscious, and not at all likely to make a deal with a poor white trash nincompoop like Hitler to take over his realm. And at the same time, he was sufficiently worried about the communists to read the London Daily Worker every day. Churchill rescued his army anyway in France and began a determined fight to save Britain and destroy Hitler. Now for a moment we want to take a look at Stalin versus Trotsky number 7, or number 8 actually, on May 1st, 1940, what I like to call the comeuppance. I have one more thing, Koba. Speaking was Lavrenti Beria. Go ahead, responded the boss. Siqueiros is going to be able to get to the Antichrist. How is that? Rivera's home was a perfect sanctuary for him. It is well guarded because of Diego and because President Cardenas had wanted him secure. But the scumbag Trotsky has had a sexual affair with the wife, Frida Kahlo, of his host, Diego Rivera. Thus Trotsky and Rivera have had a falling out, which is currently assumed to be political, except among those in the household, where, as you know, we have an agent waiting. President Cardenas is disgusted and will now stand aside. And I might mention that you should see the Salma Hayek-produced movie Frida and the now streaming movie at Netflix called The Chosen for inside views of the events leading to Trotsky's ultimate demise. So Stalin continued, "It's much better for a Mexican of the caliber of Siqueiros to handle this if at all possible." Now, of course, I hope Siqueiros will, but you know what these guys are like. Big mouths, short on thinking and planning. Well, if necessary, pull out Ramon, that is Ramon Mercader. We have to tie off all the loose ends before this war starts. Is his mother with him? Yes, she is, working directly with Nahum, that is also known as Leonid Eintingen. Koba, I just wanted you to know that Trotsky moved to another home in the Coyoacan locality, much easier for us to attack, which we will be able to handle, either with this fumble-bum Siqueiros or with our own agent. Anyway, it's just a matter of days or a few weeks now. And for more on this, there is the 2009 biography entitled The Eintings by Mary K. Wilmers. What are the chances of getting Ramon out alive? Not good. He thinks he may be able to kill Trotsky silently and make his escape, but I suspect this is wishful thinking. I hate to leave a great comrade like Ramon to that fate if there's any way to help him exit. No, I know you can't do anything more than you are doing, but you know what I mean. Keep me informed, of course. And if there is nothing else... No, Lavrenti, as usual, you're doing a superb job. Felix would be proud of you, as I am. Thank you, Koba. That's the nicest thing you ever said to me. One of my worst failings lies in my failing to acknowledge great contributions. If I haven't said so before, I apologize. Oh, that's not necessary, Koba. I'd better go. Now, what had just happened passed into history for Stalin as an afterthought of a long day at work. However, for Beria, it was the beginning of a new day. Koba never complimented people like that unless he really meant it. Why now? Now, we have seen that Joseph Stalin and Leon Trotsky hated each other and had from the beginning of the Bolshevik movement, to which Trotsky had always been an enemy, until 4 months before the October Revolution. But why kill him now in 1940? Why not much earlier, as Stalin could easily have arranged? I believe the answers to both questions are rather obvious once you stop and think about it. Trotsky was so arrogant and personally repugnant to most of the Bolshevik Party members, high and low, that having him as an enemy was actually helpful. As time proceeded, and Trotsky was in exile on Principe Island, or Europe, or Mexico, he and his followers kept up a racket. Trotsky was famous, so his minor press and parties made it easy for people to accept Stalin's ongoing main proposition, namely that the USSR had internal fifth columnists and enemies at every gate. However, as the inevitable World War II came closer, Stalin did not want to take the chance that Trotsky would raise a false flag, creating one more enemy out of some of those who should be supporting the USSR. And true to form, the Trot newspaper, The Militant in New York, called for Stalin's overthrow as Nazi troops were driving on Moscow. Trotsky had long ago joined the ranks of Judas Iscariot and Benedict Arnold, and was certainly not above making a deal with the Nazis, if he thought it would help him regain power. Accordingly, Trotsky now had to die, and he did, just 10 months before the Soviet Union was at war with Germany. Trotsky dies, August 20th, 1940. Trotsky did not have long to live. First, Siqueiros tried to kill him with a squad of gunmen who poured roughly 100 rounds into his bedroom window on May 23, 1940. Now, Beria's fears proved accurate as Siqueiros and his crew fucked up what should have been a simple enough hit, and even with Eintingen escorting them to the gate, where an undercover agent opened the door. In the event, Siqueiros, despite all his good intentions, proved to be no more skilled in these black arts in his home country than he had been in military ones in Spain. Trotsky managed to escape by hiding under the bed, the assassins failing to enter the bedroom to be sure they had done the job. Nevertheless, Siqueiros was a great red artist and left a long-lasting impression in his revolutionary murals in Mexico. All who travel there see them to this very day. On August 20th, 1940, Beria pulled out his undercover agent Ramon Mercader, who buried an ice pick in Trotsky's head. However, escape for Ramon was impossible, as Trotsky let out a blood-curdling shriek. Mercader later said he would never forget it. Mercader was captured by Trotsky's Minneapolis Teamster bodyguards and turned over to the Mexican police, who brought him to trial. His boss, Leonid Eintingen, had been waiting outside in a car, along with Mercader's longtime associate and mother. Both had to beat a retreat. Mother Mercader made her way to Moscow and received a hero's welcome. She lived quietly in Moscow on a chica pension and apartment, consulting on Spain and Mexico until she died, her death being before her son was able to finish his 20-year Mexican prison term. Stalin must have found it amusingly ironic that Mercader killed Trotsky with a mountain-climbing tool, an ice pick. For decades, Trotsky had never failed in his calumny of snide personal abuse, often describing Stalin as a mountain climber, as if this athletic endeavor is all he was ever good for. Now, Trotsky died by the mountain-climbing ice pick. I don't know about Stalin, but I would have found this cold revenge immensely satisfying. We do know that Stalin was publicly pleased because, in absentia, Joseph Stalin presented Ramon Mercader with the Order of Lenin, and his accomplice and mother, Caridad del Rio Hernandez, also received the Order of Lenin from Stalin. The bullet holes and the blood on the floor from the ice pick attack were preserved, along with the home itself, for those wishing to visit this Coyoacan suburb of Mexico City, now a museum. Carlos Prieto later made a documentary movie about this entire matter and brought me in on all the essential details a half-century ago. In the aftermath, the Trotskyists tried to make a big deal out of the assassination by trying to prove Stalin had given the order. Not that there was any doubt in anyone's mind about who gave the order, especially after Stalin gave the imprisoned Mercader the Order of Lenin and gave the Order of Lenin to his mother, Caridad del Rio Hernandez. However, in the latter part of 1940, the imperialists were at war with each other in Europe. The Nazis were preparing to attack the Soviet Union, were being actively encouraged to do so by the rotten British and French ruling capitalist oligarchy. Thus, Trotsky passed into history without very many caring very much. On May 6, 1960, Mercader completed his 20-year Mexican sentence and was released. He flew first to Havana and then on to Moscow. There in 1961, Nikita Khrushchev personally greeted him, and the Cheka, then called the KGB, awarded him the medal Hero of the Soviet Union. Mercader passed some of his remaining days in Moscow on a generous Cheka pension with a suitable apartment, and then he spent most of his remaining years in Cuba. He had acquired considerable knowledge about Latin America from the unique perspective available only to political prisoners in high-security Mexican prison. He continued his Cheka KGB work as a contract consultant on Latin America and as a consultant for the Cuban DGI until his death of old age. The Cubans found him helpful, and of course by this time he had become quite at home with Latin American culture. He was, after all, a Spanish speaker to begin with. Now, a few comments on the Mexican intelligentsia of that period. I have often said that I never met any real intellectuals until I went to Mexico in 1962. I had, however, met a few in Idaho, including Professor Dan Bonnell, attorney Gideon Oppenheimer, industrialist Art Troutner and his art patron wife Kathy Troutner, Merle Wells, and Frank Church, and my age mates Barry Marcus and Carol McGregor. And I had met real intellectuals in London working for the BBC in 1961, although I was only there for a month of June, leaving London the day before the baby was born that became Princess Diana years later. I have described that event under the subheading Lady X, the closest friend of Mother Spencer, in my autobiography, The Buccaneer. However, it was in Mexico City that I met intellectuals by the bushel, so to speak, via the good offices of the well-known Mexican playwright and communist and one-time Soviet and later Cuban agent, Carlos Prieto Aguirre. If you type "A Crime Against the Lambs" into your browser, there are family photos. His surviving daughter, Ayari Prieto Stock, has written a biographical sketch of this great Mexican revolutionary. My experiences with these people changed my life. For the first time, I realized my intellectual predilection for Marxism had made me part of the most advanced class of thinking people in the world. There had been no turning back for me anyway. I had chosen my side, and nothing could dissuade me from my scientifically derived decision. Nevertheless, meeting hundreds of people who thought the same way I did for the same reasons was a wonderful change in the world as far as I was concerned. Now, as to Trotsky's last love. I mentioned this here because a very fine example of this class, the Mexican intelligentsia, and the general milieu of those times is shown in the 2002 Salma Hayek-produced movie Frida. This movie, about the wife of Diego Rivera, Frida Kahlo, starring Salma Hayek, Alfred Molino, and Jeffrey Rush, is the first time in the bourgeois movie industry, of which I'm aware, where Frida's sexual episode with Trotsky is explored. Left movie makers seem to have been allergic to describing Trotsky's simple human failing in this regard, and I think this is extremely ungenerous. After what he'd been through, Trotsky had to be in fragile shape, and perhaps Miss Kahlo really helped him. The fact that Trotsky's wife was with him during this affair in the same household, and we know he felt very bad about that, makes me think even more so that he was not emotionally stable by this time. I think history tells us why. Stalin had left him alive, but stripped of just about everything. His self-confidence and perhaps his manhood had to be in personal question. To me, Trotsky at this point in his life is a person to be pitied, not hated. Lenin himself, after all, had brought Trotsky on board initially. Lenin had to see some good qualities in Trotsky, and in fact Trotsky did perform useful services until he missed the succession altogether. Stalin was a man who never forgot a slight, a man who never failed to remember a hurt, a man who was exceptionally sensitive to what others might have risen above, for example, snide class background comments, and he saw Trotsky through the glasses of hurt and sensitivity. For Stalin, his nemesis had become the author of all Trotskyite conspiracies, real and imagined. On the other hand, Trotsky had made himself into Stalin's political nemesis and brought this upon himself. With World War II imminent, Trotsky was a false flag raiser, and now, accordingly, Trotsky had to die. Ms. Hayden Herrera bases the book upon which the movie is based, and the cinematics are exactly right. I would highly recommend this movie to get an idea of the cultural setting of the Mexican intelligentsia, which was still virtually unchanged when I arrived in Mexico City at the beginning of September in 1962, and I have described some of this in The Buccaneer, which is volume 1 of my autobiography, Idaho Smith's Search for the Foundation. Now, who will attack first? The imperialist war against the Soviet Union cannot be delayed forever. One could jockey only so long until it would be a reality, and Stalin had been doing his best to gain strategic advantage on his western borders, moving Soviet attack forces closer and closer to those borders, and demanding and getting territorial concessions. Stalin was preparing the option of striking the Nazis first. In the beginning of 1941, Stalin needed to wait one more year, or perhaps 18 months. Why? For the newest Spanish Civil War-derived T-34 land tanks and the Sturmovik aerial tanks to be produced in sufficient numbers to guarantee victory. The spring of 1941 turned to summer. The fascist regimes on Soviet borders were told what to do or else by Stalin. Bulgaria was to provide access to its rivers, and Romania was required to surrender certain adjacent territories to the Soviet Union. Galicia was largely incorporated into the western Ukraine. Other defensive steps had been taken against Nazi-supported fascist Finland, while the reactionary regimes in Lithuania, Estonia, and Latvia were eliminated when Soviet troops occupied them in the fall of 1939. Germany continued to be tied up in combat in Greece and now Yugoslavia. On May 1, 1941, Stalin orders a spoiling attack. Quote, Vlad, since we don't know what the Nazis may be planning on our frontiers and there's way too much movement too close to our western border, this possibility of launching a major Yugoslav offensive is of critical importance. I want you to tell Tito to attack them now. In the spring of 1941, Joseph Stalin's old friend, Joseph Broz Tito, came to the boss's rescue by launching a deadly counteroffensive against Nazi troops in Serbia. This delayed the German assault on the Soviet Union for 5 critical weeks. Now, you will recall Tito was last seen in Paris, where he guided the inflow of fighter volunteers, the Internationals, to the Republican camp in Albacete, Spain. In the interim, Stalin had sent him home to Yugoslavia to begin preparations for the liberation of that sorry country, still suffering under the jackboot of its own ruling class. Therefore, he was in place to organize and lead the attack on occupying Nazi troops in the spring of 1941 that delayed Hitler's on the USSR for these 5 critical weeks. Now, before Tito's war against the Nazis concluded in 1944, 1.4 million Yugoslavs, 10% of the Yugoslav population, would be murdered by the master race. The Nazi attack finally gets underway on June 22, 1941. On that date, the Nazis attacked the Soviet Union. Hitler had been almost as good as his word. He just waited until he thought he had secured his western frontier before turning against the Bolsheviks on his eastern one. Along the way, Hitler took his European allies with him in this desperate adventure. The people of these countries would rue the day they allowed that decision, and among their soldiers, no more than a handful would return home alive. For example, Spanish fascist troops, victorious in Spain, would be liquidated in totality in Russia. Why? Because Franco had joined the Anti-Comintern Pact and sent several divisions of Spanish troops against the USSR in Hitler's surprise attack. They would die and never see home again. Now, contrary to imperialist propaganda, Stalin entered the war with the advantage. He had only to fight the great capitalist powers one front at a time, and in the meantime had neutralized the others. This was the final triumphant advantage, as the decades-long program of unified capitalist attack against the Soviet Union had been definitively destroyed by the equally decades-long Leninist foreign policy of Rapallo, that is, keeping the countries divided. So we had the Soviet Neo-Napoleonic battle plan from June 22, 1941 to December 5, 1941. Since 1917, the Soviet Union had been preparing for this capitalist assault against the homeland of the world socialist stage. We reviewed the publication of P.P. Karadygin's 1924 General Foundations of the Mobilization of Industry for the Needs of War textbook for the Red Army, and Michael Frunze's introduction, Front and Rear in the Future War. By 1941, all of the necessary preliminary steps in the unification of the Red Army and Navy with the essential civilian industrial base had been accomplished. Dividing the imperialist encirclement. We saw how the supportive Soviet foreign policy had begun in 1922 at Rapallo and continued for 19 years, that is until June 22, 1941. As tricky as the entire strategy had been, it had been successful. Germany had been kept from allying with the other imperialist states, and Japan's adventurous militarism humiliatingly defeated. European mirror image is just the same. Then in June 1941, the Leninist foreign policy continued, although this time it featured the USSR allied with the English-speaking world against world fascism. Maintained was the Rapallo principle of keeping the imperialist countries divided. Remember that imperialist, in Marxist terminology, means the highest phase of the capitalist stage. Now, as far as preventing a joint attack against the USSR was concerned, it began with the bloc between the Soviet Republic and Germany against the victors of World War I. After the Hitlerites attacked the USSR June 22, 1941, Lenin's policy continued as a bloc with the USA and its Latin American de facto colonies, and England and its empire. Lenin and his successors knew that another world war was inevitable and that capitalism would attack us eventually. In summary, the capitalist attack had to be made particulate. It was made so through two stages. One, our bloc with Germany that began at Rapallo in 1922, and two, the bloc with the English-speaking world. This began in June of 1941 with the Nazi attack on us and the immediate decision in Britain and the USA to support the USSR. Japan continued to be afraid to confront us because of the lessons they learned at Khalkhin Gol 2 years earlier. Given our technological limitations, we wanted to fight the global capitalist stage one part at a time. One part of the world capitalist stage at a time meant one capitalist country or block of countries at a time, thus being made particulate. Stalin for 20 years had done everything humanly possible to prepare for the inevitable Second World War. Now it had come, and the USSR had a war plan as well as a general mobilization strategy of what we have come to call People's War. First of all, that plan began with the strategic overview of being able to assume the Eastern Front against Japan and the USA would be neutralized. Secondly, then the USSR would have option A to attack the Western Alliance, meaning attack the Nazis first, or now that the war had begun, with the Germans making the first move, which was 3, the Soviet Union had option B, which was to absorb the Western attack. This meant, now in practice, to absorb the 3.5 million man German attack with military and civilian resistance, slowing down the aggressor, while the Soviet High Command fought with Stalin retreat tactics and prepared the counterstrike. The second option, option B, then put forward the responding Soviet battle plan under the title the Neo-Napoleonic Battle Plan. This plan was known only to the higher echelons of the party, the Stavka, that is, military high command, and the Cheka, although the strategy was common knowledge and had been since 1924. That strategy had its foundations and fundamentals in Karadygin's textbook, General Foundations, and Frunze's introductory essay, front and rear in future war. Everything since that time had been built according to that doctrine, and according to the tactical doctrine of deep battle or deep operations. And you may wish to go back to chapter 12 in the first volume and review the historical debate over appropriations for the Red Army and Red Navy in the 1920s in the initial attempt to provide the fundings for the Karategin strategy. Then focus on the fact that it was only Stalin's revolution from above which meant the strategy could finally be realized and made material. Option B, the Neo-Napoleonic battle plan. 1. In the event, the USSR would have to conduct a defensive war and absorb the incoming 3.5 million Nazi and satellite troops while preparing a counterstrike in Moscow. Along the way, it would have to fortify both the northern and southern elements of the battle line that would extend from Leningrad, that is St. Petersburg or Petrograd, to the Caucasus, Batum and Baku. Now, every element of civil society, secondly, as well as the military fronts, would have to be involved. This meant the citizens of the great Soviet cities of the West would have to fight one way or another right alongside the Red Army. This was a modernized anti-Napoleon strategy in that it would feature scorched earth from the western frontier to the stabilized front running from Leningrad to Moscow and south to Baku and Batum. And thirdly, the Germans were getting weaker by the day as they expanded into the Soviet Union. At least 1 million of the 3.5 million soldiers they sent against socialism would die in the 6 months from June 22nd to December 5th. Their machinery was destroyed, worn out, and ultimately frozen. 4. Meanwhile, the Soviets moved a great deal of the Western industrial plant behind the Urals, where it was literally inserted into the top-secret military-industrial complex. All of this was done according to the Neo-Napoleonic battle plan Stalin and his generals had drawn up over the previous 17 years. Inherent to this plan was a modern people's war, in that the civilian population would not be evacuated. Instead, the party would have to see it that the civilians fought too, whatever that meant, even if it meant just being in place and having to be taken prisoner or killed. Now, the thinking behind this strategy and battle plan had begun with publication of P.P. Karategin's textbook, General Foundations, and the introduction by Red Army Chief of Staff and 1925 War Commissar Michael Frunze entitled Front and Rear in Future War. Now, the strategic battle plan was to be concluded by the movement of available Red Army elite units into position behind Moscow in order to launch a deep battle counterstrike at the moment the Aryans became most vulnerable. However, now in practice, with the Red Army engaged across this thousands of mile-long main front, Stalin had only about 30 of these elite divisions, that is some 300,000 men, immediately available in reserve in the West for the counterstrike. This was not enough to guarantee the success of the Neo-Napoleonic battle plan. To do the job and reverse the Nazi assault, he needed to move another 40 elite divisions into position, that is, another 400,000 men, from the anti-Japanese Mongolian front and put them together with the 30 elite reserve divisions already near Moscow. The strategic battle plan would then call on the tactical doctrine of deep operations as perfected against the Japanese at the Battle of Khalkhin Gol 2 years earlier, which we reviewed in the last lecture. Now, this meant hitting the Germans with 70 divisions hard and continuously, not only at the front, but also on their flanks and the rear, making it impossible for them to regain their footing and dig in, leaving only retreat and or chaotic rout as a choice. The Germans retreated and chaotically ran. In the process, the Krauts lost 100 miles of territory as the Red Army taught them what deep battle was all about. In the end, this battle plan worked perfectly, as intended and planned. However, the cost was indeed quite high for us, as well as for the incoming scum, and this is how it happened. So we'll take another inside snapshot between Stalin and Zhukov on July 25th, 1941. This is just a month after the Nazis attacked. Now, pacing in his Kremlin office, Marshal, that is 5-star U.S. general rank, and now Supreme Commander of all Soviet military forces, Joseph Stalin walked to the door being opened by Poskrebyshev, extending his good right hand to grasp that of one-star Brigadier General George Zhukov, commander of the Far East Red Army District. The two men walked directly to the war map on the wall of the Stavka's Supreme Commander, Red Army High Command Supreme Commander Joseph Stalin, and gradually made their way to the couch at the side of the room the boss rarely used, and then only with his closest friends or most important conversationalists of the moment. George, I made the decision to send you to the western frontier and then to move our attack vanguard forces to that frontier in the west in order to try and impress Hitler with the impossibility of launching a successful attack, or to get ready for a first strike, as you know. Unfortunately, our preparations did not work. If anything, they made Hitler think correctly. If he was to have any chance at all, he had to attack us this year, and to do so in such a way as to knock us out of the war by the onset of the holiday season. We lost 1,800 aircraft on the ground on the first day, George, and it gets worse with each passing day after that. Fortunately, the attack vanguard forces we lost were the oldest and least important aircraft, so we will recover. Although it will take a year to get our aircraft and anti-tank factories producing to maximum capability behind the Urals. The only good part of this is that the Nazis made their main attack against our least important aircraft and tank forces. The truth is, our best new Spanish experienced designed air attack force, the Sturmovix, and the T-34 tank force, is already being pushed into top priority overtime production and will be available in force next year. Between now and then, unless I can come up with military assistance from the U.S., it will continue to be a massive GNP struggle to get re-equipped, while the Red Army fights a defensive war of attrition and maneuver. Now what it comes down to is we can hold a line here, follow me, from Leningrad to Moscow and south to Batum. That is for this year, and probably next year, although the Germans are going to have to go for the oil sooner or later. At the moment, that oil is not their primary target. For whatever reason, they are coming straight for us here in Moscow. 500,000 of them, at least, I figure, are left in their Army Group Center. Now, we could turn this against them if you were able to move your entire main force from Siberia to Moscow in time to do another Khalkhin-Gol type envelopment. But I can't move you unless I know the Japs aren't coming for us. When will you know? Probably tonight. Do you mind me asking, Koba, how do you know? I have a spy on the Japanese General Staff. They are meeting right now on this question. Jesus Christ, I mean, whatever it should be these days, I had no idea. No wonder you had the order of battle at Khalkhin-Gol. Hey, Mike. Let me call you back. I'm in the middle of doing this lecture. Oh, okay, bye. Well, what do you think they will decide to do? Go for it or back off? I think they will back off, but the pressure from Berlin is powerful. We are countering it as best we can, but I'm afraid we may lose our best agent if he keeps up what he's doing. I have asked him to risk it all in trying to convince the Japs not to go for German overtures to enter the war. His masters in Berlin SS could easily discover he is doing what he's doing, and that will be the end of our asset there. At any rate, if we can move your forces, how long will it take to get ready for an encirclement of the German Army Group Center? I can be in place in 12 weeks, specifically 40 well-trained fresh divisions, 10,000 man per division, at full TO&E, including all of our aircraft. And Koba, the troops are all pumped up. They just gave a humiliating whipping to the Japs, and they are very well provisioned and eager to get at this disgusting fascist enemy hand to hand. They know they can be saviors of the country, and I have never seen morale so high, even back in the Civil War, Koba. At any rate, in 12 weeks we will have these 40 divisions joining your elite 30 divisions within 60 miles of Moscow in front of the Urals, where hopefully the Nazi forward air recon will not be able to reach. So it will be winter, or at least nearly so, when we launch the counterattack, and we will be better prepared for that than they will be. Furthermore, our army group will be moving forward to combat directly in front of Moscow without further preparation. Going off the march, in winter, mind you, will be part of the direct attack in the offensive. In other words, and this will be an additional 400,000 troops on our side the Krauts don't know about and will not be expecting. They will be forced onto a defensive posture immediately, and you know we won't let them dig in. Now, Stalin said, I don't expect to win the war here, George, but I need to know if we can hold Moscow. I want you to always tell me the truth on this one point. I know the call may change from day to day, and I want you to tell me about changes, in your view, day to day. Do you understand? Yes, Comrade Stalin, I understand, and you can count on one thing. And that would be? When you bring my army group to Moscow, we will stop these cabbage-eating cocksuckers cold and give them an ass-whipping that will make what we did to the Japs look like a Sunday school picnic. Orlov and FDR, Harry Hopkins to Moscow. Meanwhile, Stalin's long-planned need for Orlov to enter the picture in a decisive event-changing way succeeded. Orlov used his existing route to FDR to assure the U.S. President the Soviet Union under its chief, Comrade Marshal Stalin, would never agree to anything other than total destruction of Hitler and his entire Nazi gang, no matter what the cost or consequences. FDR then decided to send his most trusted representative to Moscow, Harry Hopkins, to see what the situation really was and what, if anything, FDR could do to help. See the movie World War II When Lions Roared, starring John Lithgow, Michael Caine, Bob Hoskins as Roosevelt, Stalin, and Churchill. And that brings us to a conclusion of this particular lecture. And in the next one, we're going to go on for the battle for Berlin. The battle for Moscow.